Hello. Thank you for joining us for the Children's Institute Spring Spotlight Series seminar. My name is Caitlin Orbanik. I am a health project coordinator for Children's Institute, and I will be serving as today's moderator. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Anne Marie White, Executive Director of Children's Institute.
Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you to today's Spotlight Series. We are very grateful you're taking the time to join us as a collective community. We know you're in many spaces in our local community, and this is our first time we're able to take the Spotlight Series and go national through this wonderful technology. And we recognize it's time for us to do that because we're all in something collectively that we want to be tending our children around. We've been listening and learning and watching and really trying to think how we want to come together and around what topics that's really important for us to be supporting ourselves, the adults that support children, and children themselves. We know we're facing a time of a lot of anticipatory grief, wondering what uncertain future still lay ahead, and knowing that that can bring wounds that if we don't name or give space for in our lives, can cry out in the future. So we're really here today to come together and support one another, figure out how we can continue to support children in the times ahead. And we are also very thankful for the opportunity to do that across the spectrum of childhood, drawing upon the many experts that are at Children's Institute who are here to speak with you today that Caitlin will introduce. I just want to take one other moment to say thank you to Caitlin, to Cindy Harper, and to others on the staff who really worked to make this opportunity possible today. So Caitlin, back to you.
Dr. White. Our topic today is helping young people cope with stress and anxiety in uncertain times. As Dr. White said, of course, this topic pertains greatly to our current situation around COVID-19 and our community's broad efforts to flatten the curve of transmission. But the information shared here today really is applicable to youth development at any time. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. We will hear first from Earl Green. Earl is a childhood mental health consultant with Children's Institute and a certified anger management specialist. Following Earl's headline address, we will learn from our panel about practical strategies that we can immediately put into place to support youth of all ages. Our panel today consists of Dr. Lynn Lubecki, the Early Childcare Education Strategies Director at Children's Institute, Linda Murray, a project coordinator for the Rochester Area Parent Program with over 15 years experience in parent education, and Dr. Charles Inferna, a research associate at Children's Institute and collegiate athletics coach. Further information about all of our speakers' credentials and areas of expertise can be found at the link contained in the comments section below this video. However, I would like to make special note of the fact that all of our speakers today are parents, and some are even grandparents. Following our speaker's address, all four will be available for questions. Please enter questions into the comments or chat feature of this page, and we will work through as many as we can in the time available. Finally, following the seminar, you will receive a link to an evaluation survey. All feedback is greatly appreciated, and completing the survey will also result in us sending you a certificate of participation for today's session for professional development credit hours. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Earl Green.
Hello and welcome. I thank you for this participation in this webinar. And I am grateful to the Children's Institute for inviting and trusting me with this most serious topic. And I want to just briefly talk with you about understanding ACEs, trauma, toxic stress, and building resilience. So I want to begin by defining trauma and toxic stress. I believe that this is very much worth going through. And just so we have a clear understanding, I think since we have this frame up first, we'll talk with you about the CDC Kaiser Permanente. This is a study that was largely done to evaluate ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. It is the largest ongoing investigation of childhood abuse and neglect and dealing with health and well-being. And it looked at 17,000 children to examine the prevalence of ACE exposure, demonstrated a clear link between the occurrence of traumatic events in childhood and negative health and behavioral outcomes throughout the lifespan. And the study continues even today. This is very important to understand, for there are a number of ACEs that I want to highlight during this talk. Next frame, please. So defining trauma, and I think it's very important. We've talked so much about trauma. We talked a lot about toxic stress, but I thought it would be important for us to revisit the definition and how we want to look at this. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or sets of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And that, moving to toxic stress, this can occur when experienced strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity. And to have a real good picture as to what this actually looks like when we talk about the impact of trauma, what it is, toxic stress, we're talking about children, families who have experienced child abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, domestic violence, substance use disorders, alcoholism, natural disasters, poverty, generational poverty, and in this particularly hunger, disproportionate impact of school suspensions, racism, discrimination, and we can go on. All of these events have a profound impact on the child's health as well as a child's learning. So as we look at this idea of trauma and toxic stress and the behaviors that we see in children as well as adults, it really helps us to really understand behaviors and how do we help people overcome these this impact. Next frame. So when we talk about toxic stress, we also looked at the impact that it has on the brain. And this is where a child's health and learning really comes into importance for us. So when we talk about the impact it has on the brain, and keep in mind that we're talking about a developing brain. Now, understanding this, we must understand that the brain actually develops from the back forward. And the last part of the brain that is fully developed is the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe. Generally, this is not fully developed until age 25 or 26 years old. In some cases, we found that prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until age 30. But when we talk about stress and the impact that it has on the brain, we're talking about loss of neurons. And typically, and I'm just providing you with the basic understanding of this, each one of us are born with pretty much about 100 million neurons. However, through the lifespan, neurons are lost based on the experiences that we have and occurrences in our lives. But when we talk about the developing brain and this happening at a very young age, we're talking about a very serious impact that it has on the developing brain. So when children experience toxic stress and the impacts on the brain, we're talking about changes in the size of some brain structures, changes to connections between neurons, and changes in activities in some regions of the brain. So in order to help us, in order to help children and families, I thought I loved this particular saying by Carl Jung, to confront a person with his own shadow is to show him his own light. And so as people are impacted by trauma and toxic stress and the impact that it has on our brains, what we cannot conclude is that they are at a loss. They can bounce back. And this is what resilience is really all about. Building resilience. So when we talk, what is it? So the ability to thrive, adapt, and cope despite these stressful times. It's a natural counterweight to adverse childhood experiences, not an innate characteristic. And that is something that we have to understand, but rather it is a skill that can be taught, learned, and practiced. Now, while some children do have the ability to bounce back, most of their ability to have resilience or really bounce back into a healthier place, it does require teaching, learning, and practice. The more resilient, the more likely we are to deal with negative situations in a healthy way that won't have prolonged and unfavorable outcomes. But everyone has the ability to become resilient. So in doing that, what does this look like? What do we do to teach and to help our children practice resilience? Number one is promoting safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. One of the things that we've learned in learning more about trauma, toxic stress, and the impact it has on a child's health and a child's learning is that the greatest thing is the healthy, supportive adult relationships. We can never underestimate the power of healthy and supportive relationships, as well as healthy, structured environments in order to facilitate resilience. So research suggests that the single most factor for children who develop resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. And understanding the neuroscience of resilience is very important, because as we help children bounce back, what we're actually doing is opening the windows of plasticity that allows the brain to change itself. And by doing this, there are also expressions in brain continually changing with experience, even in adults. And this is very true, especially with adults who have experienced trauma and toxic stress at a very young age. And now as adults, they're also discovering themselves, learning new strategies. And as they learn these new strategies and implement these new strategies, they're also experiencing a change. So behavioral intervention changes the brain, as well as mindfulness-based stress reduction. So last but not least, the neuroscience of harm and healing. The brain is a plastic and malleable organ that responds to intervention designed to redirect its function toward healthier physiology and behavior. So it's very important as we move to build resilience, teach, help children, practice, putting into place those strategies and creating healthier, supportive, structured environments can have a profound impact on a child's ability to bounce back. And I believe that even with children who are still living in volatile situations or unhealthy situations, we found that as long as those supports are in place, the children can still thrive, learn, and become healthier. We also found this in children who are in those toxic and unstable environments, that school, after-school programs, other extracurricular activities where children are in a structured and safe environment also contributes to that child's ability to really bounce back and to practice resilience in their lives. Caitlin?
Earl, thank you so much for that. We always hear that it's so empowering once people have a good understanding of the brain and how young people's brains are developing, and that really helps us make space for them to have that time to develop. So at this time, I'd like to move over to Dr. Lynn Lubecki. Again, Lynn's expertise is in early childhood development, and as our speakers talk, they'll be following a progression of expertise in different developmental levels. So Lynn, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and I appreciate the wisdom of Earl, and you've heard how we're creating an experience for our families. This is a very difficult time, and you can move that to the next slide, Caitlin. You can see that you as the parent, you as the family member are the most important person in a young child's life. We're talking infancy, you know, into toddler, preschool, 5 years old through 8 years old. You are the most important person in that child's life. And I'm sure it's a picnic being with them right now as you're trying to work from home, especially if you have more than one of those little people running around you as you're trying to do your Zoom meetings. We call those our coworkers. And I understand that parenting is the hardest thing you'll ever do. I understand also that the stresses that we have in our lives right now can be very serious, and they can be very difficult. Just as was mentioned, that that anticipatory grief. You have, you know, will I have a position? Will I have a job? Is there enough money? Is there enough food? Is there, what's going to happen next week? Are my children going back to childcare? What's going to happen? These are very serious things. But your children, your young children, take their cues from you. They take their cues. They can remain calm. They can understand the seriousness and the newness of the situation by watching how you are and watching how you manage the situation. While it's not an easy task, and I can understand that from many levels as a parent and grandparent, it's something that you can think about, because self-care is not a selfish act. Self-care as a parent, and the best of times, self-care is a gift we can give ourselves. And when we give ourselves that care, physically, emotionally, mentally, we can be there for our little babies. We can be there for our toddlers and preschoolers. And that's something to consider under any circumstances. But as my wise friend Earl says, never more than right now. We need to care for ourselves in a way that we have not had to, possibly in our lives. Maybe we have just neglected that, because it feels like a selfish act when you're trying to take care of others. But that's a really important piece. How do I do that? Paying attention on how you feel. How do you feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel worried? Do you feel overwhelmed? And do you feel that grief? All of that is normal. I think I feel them all every 15 minutes throughout my workday. Right? This is a big deal. It's a thing. But if we notice and we pay attention how we're feeling, we can pay attention how we're reflecting, how we're projecting what we're feeling inside around our children. And maybe we can take a moment to manage that. When we're under stress as adults, we have behaviors that might show up during this traumatic kind of an event. Moodiness, snappiness, anybody experience that in their adult life? Children do as well. During this period of time, you won't often get a toddler to sit you down and say, you know, I'm feeling a little stressed right now. I might need a break. Normally, their behavior is expressed through their feelings, their emotions, their anxieties are expressed through behavior. So it's very helpful to imagine your young children expressing and communicating through their behavior what they're feeling at that time. And it's just something you can think about that says, oh, my child is differently behaving, mistakenly behaving, misbehaving. And you can look and say, I wonder why, what's happening here? And you can encourage our little people to tell us when something is wrong through their behavior. We can kind of pick up the cues, if you will. It's like something's up here. Do you need a break? How are you feeling? And then you can make that time for self-care by walking, taking a walk. I've incorporated my 3 miles a day so that I can keep myself together. Doing video chats possibly with your friends for no purpose other than to say hello and to have some social time, or taking a long bath, whatever works for you. Those are ways that you can contribute to helping your young children during this time of the pandemic. Can we move to the next slide, Caitlin? These are some of the tips that we picked up and are really helpful. And we have some links for you later on in the conversation, is to be available. Try to be available for your children. And what does that look like? Listen to their feelings and thoughts and beliefs. Trying to talk about things. I know you miss your friends at childcare or preschool. I know that you miss them, and kind of identify some of the ways you're hearing. I see your body has a lot of energy right now. Would you like to go for a walk, or shall we have a dance party? Right? You're paying attention to what your child's feelings are going on, what their emotions are like, and you become present and available. Let them know they're safe. I had a very interesting interaction with a young coworker who's 4 years old, just turned 5. And I was talking with her through Zoom with her mom. And she said, I was trying to kind of say, well, during this situation, we're all working from home. And she said, oh, you mean the virus? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I mean. I mean the virus, right? And I dropped something off at my son's house, and there were 2 little people with their mama. And I was, everybody had their masks on, and we got out of our car, and this little 4-year-old screams out, hey, 6 feet, people, 6 feet, right across the street. I couldn't help laugh. It was funny. You can teach your child things they can do to feel safe, right? Washing hands. We wash our hands all the time in early childhood. Wash your hands, sing a song A, B, C, D 25 times. You're gonna get really great at that. Routines are so important for little people. Routines are all, they've been thrown up and they're out of control right now. So what do? We make the best of what we can make, and we try to do as close to the routine as we had, or create one using pictures with their faces on it. What time we get up, when do we eat, when do we go outside? Learning is everywhere. No pressure on academic learning because it's everywhere. You can see leaves, you can see trees. Right now, everything is budding. It's beautiful. Flowers, all different colors. We've got a lot to do on a walk. And always have a plan B. Any preschool teacher or any infant toddler teacher always knows, have a plan B, C, D, have an alternative, because it helps children say, uh-oh, we can't do this today, but we can do that. And then build family time into the routine. To think that we're going to work, or to think that we're going to have a full 8, 12 hours, whatever we normally do, and not build in that family time, that's not realistic. Children will tell you when they need you. Build it in, and then we can build it into their day, like not at 1 o'clock, but maybe at 2 o'clock. We have a set time and a routine to build in that family time that they need. And finally, be aware of changes. Be aware of changes in your child's behavior, because that's a form of communication. If you see something, you can sit down, you can attend to them. So those are some tips for helping the young children through this difficult time. And on the next slide, you'll see some links that are very helpful from the National Pyramid Model Innovations. And also there's one from 0 to 3 that we'll send you after this. So thank you very much. Caitlin?
Lynn, thank you so much. I think that all of your tips are excellent for early childhood. I'm sure a lot of us that are listening that have experience working with older youth know that a lot of those continue to apply as our young people get older. I do want to reiterate for everyone that we are going to be making our slides available on our website. So after the presentation, you'll be able to download that great list of tips, and you'll be able to access these links directly. Let's move on now and hear from Linda Murray. Linda?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being part of this with us today. I want to talk today about communication, but I want to start with an image of a child that is dealing with some serious stress. So this child right here came home from school and dropped the book bag, and this was the first thing they were capable of doing. This child had the weight of the world on her shoulders, and it really was a lot. It was visible, it was almost tangible. And this child is my child. So I'm here today as an employee of Children's Institute and as the coordinator of the Rochester Area Parent Program, but I'm also here today because I am a parent. I'm a parent of 3 very different children, who deal with stress, and sometimes it looks like this, and sometimes it is much, much more subtle. So what I want to talk about is using communication as a strategy for adapting to those different needs of children. Next slide, please. So when we use communication, it seems very simple to think, oh, we can communicate with kids and that will lower their stress. It seems very basic. But what I want us to think about is really taking the opportunity to use communication in as many ways as we can to open up communication between kids, us and our kids, or the kids that we're responsible for. And so part of this is being open and honest with kids. It's giving them real answers. It's telling them, I might not know the answer right now, but I'll find out and I'll come back to you with a real answer to build trust when we do come back with a real answer, or maybe even an answer that we're more comfortable sharing once we've figured out how we want to say it. And that can be true with the news that's happening and the virus. It can also be true when we get into sticky conversations. But also, it's important for us to create opportunities to talk with our kids. And one of the best ways to do that is to follow them, to follow their lead. Like Lynn was talking about, we want to be active with our kids at any age. When we follow their interest, when our child is playing with blocks and we start playing with blocks, there's an immediate opportunity for communication. When my child wants to learn more about his very specific hobby and I start to learn it with him, we have opportunities for communication. So we want to adapt and build in those opportunities as we go. And since we've been in quarantine and school is not in session, I thought long and hard that first weekend about how I was going to build in opportunities for communication with my kids who are 12, 15, and 16, and some days aren't interested in talking at all. Because communication can mean talking with our kids, but it also means listening when our kids are trying to talk to us. So on the next slide, you'll see what I came up with as something we could use in my own personal family to help us get through and build in some routines. But mostly for me as the mom to have some communication about things that I felt were important. And so each of the columns has a letter, and that's for each one of my kids. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the areas that I really believe are important to have a healthy, balanced day. And so we start with learning. And so that can look like homework, but I didn't want my kids to feel like that was the only way that learning could happen. That could be learning something on YouTube. It could be exploring some of the amazing resources that we see out in the world, like explore.org that has 40 live webcams of animals in zoos around the world. It could be practicing instruments and doing all sorts of things. I really wanted my kids to be creative. And for some of my kids, that's very simple. They thrive in that area. And for others, it's really difficult. And this was a real reminder. I wanted them to help. I wanted them to help me. I wanted them to help having lots of people in one small house. But I also wanted them to think about what helping meant in terms of helping others. So one day this looked like us writing down funny jokes on pieces of paper, putting them in the mail and sending them to a nursing home. And it was a way to get outside of ourselves. Kids are naturally centered on themselves, and helping others is a way to bridge them out into helping. The next one I really thought long and hard about. So it's to be outside or be active. I wanted my kids to move every day, or at least have the goal of it. And I have one child who would be outside all day, every day. And I have another child who in 6.5 weeks would not open the front door, not even once. She's not interested. So what do you do to encourage and motivate your kids to get moving every day without nagging them? And so this was my idea of coming up with a way to encourage them to do that and to let me know if they had done it without me asking. So did you work out? Did you move? Did you play? Did you go outside? And it's been very successful. The next one is food, faith, and fun. Those are some of the values in my own family. And let me please say that this is this was designed for my particular family. We are the experts of our own children. And so this version works for us. It's a suggestion today that I share with you. But I will say that the food, faith, and fun was not part of the original chart. When we started, that wasn't in there. And I realized that I was really prompting and at times nagging, saying, hey, have you eaten today? I have one kid who sometimes doesn't think about eating until 3 p.m. and another kid who may overindulge. So this was my way of reminding them that they're accountable for some healthy choices in these areas. And lastly, is social. It was so important to me for my kids to be in touch with other kids. And so this was a reminder. But again, I have one kid who would FaceTime friends all day long, and I have another kid that could go a week without talking to anyone. So this was my version of thinking about how can I encourage my kids to have a healthy balance. So I want to share with you that when I introduced this to my children, I did not tell them that this is what we're doing and you have to do it, because that would not work at all. What I did was at a dinner time, which is one of the routines we've worked very hard to keep during this time, is a family dinner. We sat down and I showed them this whiteboard and said, I have this idea. And here are the parts of a day that I think are important for us to stay healthy, especially in this time when everything we know has been flipped upside down. This feels stressful. So I said, what do you think is important for a healthy, balanced day? What parts of life do you want to make sure you're trying to get to every day? Do you like the words that are up there? Could there be better words up there instead of what I wrote? Do you have some ideas and examples that we could write down that are different than what I was thinking? And I really asked for their input. We made some changes based on that. Secondly, I asked that I put out an expectation to them that every night at dinner was when I would take a look at the chart. And that thirdly, they were not expected to fill in every box every day. And I really felt like that was important because some days we're just not capable of meeting all the different, checking off all the boxes that make a balanced day. Sometimes we really need to just sit in one or two or three because that's all we could handle. And that's okay too. When I did that, I was really able to share with them what my values are around and our family values are about being healthy. But what I created, and I'm so excited about, was the opportunity for them to communicate with me without actually having to speak. So I have the opportunity to see if there are any patterns emerging. If I see that a child has not been in touch with any friends for 3 days in a row, then that's an opportunity for me to talk with them about that and support them and find out if there's more going on. Is it stress? This is a stressful time. If they haven't been exercising or moving, what sounds interesting to you? Can we take a walk together, ride a bike, or are you going to use that app you found and you're working out while you're on the phone with your friend? So this has been a really useful tool for us, and I hope that you don't mind me sharing it with you today. I hope that maybe a piece or two could be useful. And I'm really honored to be part of this conversation about supporting kids because we're all doing that in our own ways. Thanks.
Linda, thank you so much for all of that. I think it's great. Your talk made me think back to when I was an adolescent myself, and still in childhood, and very much at times unable to communicate in the ways that adults might have wanted me to. And thinking that if I had had something like this tool to be able to say, I can answer your questions if I draw it, or if I, have the ability to put a check mark or communicate in some other way, would have alleviated so much pressure on me to verbalize. So I think that keeping that in mind, that we don't always have to expect our young people to verbalize, but we can look at their behavior, we can look at their communication in other ways, is really an excellent tip for people to keep in mind, especially during this time of heightened stress for young people. So now I'd like to move on to our last panelist, Dr. Charles Inferna.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I'm really excited to be talking to you today about habits, routines, and rituals. So if we can move on to the next slide here for a moment. So what I kind of bring two different perspectives here. I have three little people in our house right now. So we have a 6, a 4, and a 2-year-old. And I'm also a former high school health teacher. So what we're going to talk about with making transition from high school to post high school life is really talking about creating habits for success. So this is an activity that I used to incorporate when I was a high school health teacher many years ago, and it's an activity that I try and incorporate with my college athletes every year as well. Because really, our habits, they bring awareness of what we do on a daily basis. So our different activities that we participate in, when we do things throughout the day, really have an impact on our success, our ultimate success. And that's defined, differently for different people. When we try and incorporate these particular strategies with our 6-year-old, the conversation is a little different than when I have the conversation with one of my 18-year-old freshmen in college or a 23-year-old senior who's getting ready to make the transition to post-collegiate life. Really, what it boils down to is accountability measures for ourselves. So how are we holding ourselves accountable to whatever goals or outcomes we want to achieve in our lives? So for some, it might be graduating from high school, maybe making the transition to college, not spending as much time on social media, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide here. So a day in the life is what I used to call the activity when I was a high school teacher way back in like 2004, 2005 was my first year of teaching. And James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, really brought these types of activities and strategies to life with a recent book that he just published. But really, when we're talking about a day in the life, we want to create a list of our daily habits, what we do from the time we wake up, pretty much till the time we go to bed in the evening. So like I said, for when we do this activity, or we try doing this activity, attempting the activity with our 6-year-old, there weren't too many daily habits. I wake up, I have breakfast, I play on the tablet, we do an activity, we go outside. There were like 20 things. When I asked my high school students or my college athletes to complete the activity, we'd get into 50, 60, 70 different habits that we go through on a daily basis. And then when we have our list of habits, we need to think to ourselves, is this a habit that is a good habit, a bad habit, or neutral? And how we decide, because there really aren't necessarily poor habits, but how we decide if the habit is good, bad, or neutral for ourselves is, does this behavior help me become the person I want to be? Or does it cast a vote against who I want to be? So for example, we wake up, we turn off the alarm, and for some of us, we might immediately check our phones, right? So for some, that might be a good habit. You're catching up with friends and family early in the morning, kind of maybe before the kids get up in the morning, unless you're like at my house, where our little guy gets up at 5:45 in the morning, and sometimes the oldest gets up at 7. So we have quite a range of times when we might be able to check our phones or just kind of catch up with what's happening in the world. So for some, they might consider that a good habit. Others might consider it, a bad habit of the first or second thing that you do when you wake up is check, your phone for social media or whatnot. And then a neutral habit are just kind of like the things that we do on a day to day that really we don't think about too much, but they're not, necessarily helping us all the time, but they're not necessarily a bad thing either. But really, it's who we want to be and do the activities and the habits that we move forward with on a daily basis. Do they ultimately help us get to reaching our goal? We'll talk about how we can do that in the next slide. So James Clear talks about implementation intention, and there's a lot of research that supports, us making a plan before we act on our habit. So it's what we intend to implement a particular habit. So the example is I will study at 3 p.m. in the library. So we're talking about ourselves. So what are we going to do? What's our behavior? And then when we put a specific time to it, we're holding ourselves accountable. So Earl did a great job talking about our neurons earlier in our presentation. So development or cognitively, right, our brains are going to fire if we tell ourselves, I will do this at a specific time in a specific location. So I will study at 3 p.m. in the library. So it's kind of holding ourselves accountable, and we're setting up a plan for ourselves. And I have this conversation with my college athletes all the time. You're always so stressed. You say you're so busy. Well, when do you study? Well, sometimes I study, early in the morning. Sometimes I study late at night. And we were trying to develop healthier habits where we know that we practice from 3 to 5 o'clock every day. Then we go have dinner from 5 to 6 p.m. Maybe we unwind with our friends from 6 until 7. And then we know that I will study my, human anatomy or whatever class it is from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. in the library. So we're kind of putting together plans for ourselves in order to ensure we're trying to lead ourselves towards accomplishing our goals. And we can stack those as well to help build upon a foundation of developing healthier habits. And we could talk about that in the next slide here. So a habit stacking formula is when we take our implementation intention and we build upon that. So kind of like if we're a teacher in the classroom where we kind of scaffold our information and we teach from lesson to a lesson that builds upon a specific skill that we want our children, to learn about. We can create habits for ourselves in our daily lives. And this is something that has really worked extremely well for the 3 little people in our house. Our oldest is having a very difficult time not being able to go to school. So he really enjoys his teacher. He enjoyed talking to his friends and things. So for us, it took a little bit more work on trying to develop new habits for him at home. So when we develop or when we stack our habits, the example that I included is after I study in the library for 1 hour, I will go to the gym, right? So maybe we're doing something that really isn't as attractive to us before we get to do something that is really fun and enjoyable for us. So after I study in the library for an hour, then I'll go to the gym. And you can incorporate whatever habit stacking formula is going to work best for you. But that's how we kind of hold ourselves accountable to whatever we want to accomplish, whether it's, having a higher GPA in high school, or we want to practice more, or we want to study more, whatever we're trying to build upon. Implementing a plan for ourselves is going to give us the best opportunity to reach those goals. You could go to the next slide. So there's a couple things when we're looking at results for ourselves. The small changes that we make throughout the day are going to lead to hopefully more positive behaviors over time. When we are aware of our cues brought on by our good habits within our environment, we're able to continue building upon those positive habits. So becoming more aware of, okay, when I get up in the morning, gosh, maybe I shouldn't check my phone right away. Let me wait maybe 10 or 15 or 20 more minutes, or let me wait till after breakfast before I get on social media right away. And then, oh, I forgot to have breakfast, or wow, I've just spent 2 hours scrolling through Instagram feed and Twitter feed, and it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and you realize most of your morning has kind of passed you by. And the most important piece that I always stress with my high school students, my college athletes is, and even with adults too, I mean, sometimes we might not have as healthy habits as we might would like, is to surround ourselves with people that have the habits that we want to incorporate for ourselves. So if I'm spending a lot of time with Caitlin and Earl, and they like conducting research and reading, and they're very studious, and I want to become more studious, well, I'm going to spend more time with them because I know that they're going to go to the library for 3 or 4 hours every night, and I'm going to either be forced to study with them, and help myself work towards my goals, or I'm just going to be sitting there while Caitlin and Earl are studying. Or if I want to not not spend as much time studying. I might spend more time with Lynn and Linda and spend more time, in the cafeteria after class or what have you, and not really incorporate in those behaviors that might lead me to being more successful. Thank you for letting me use you guys as an example, by the way, Earl and Caitlin and Lynn and Linda, when we're talking about healthy habits for ourselves.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you to our panel and thank you to all of our listeners. We're going to hear for one kind of closing thoughts from Earl. And I just want to say also that we've been having a really excellent discussion happening in the chat feature, which you should see to the right of the screen where you're watching this presentation. If you have questions that we're going to get to in a moment, I do encourage you to pose them in that chat feature. And I will take them down and pose them to our panel for you. So Earl, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yes, thank you, Caitlin. I just want to thank Lynn, Linda, and Charles for such powerful presentations. And I think that they all did an outstanding job in sharing what does building resilience really look like in real life and in real time. I think, the idea here is changing, thought processes, changing behaviors. When we talk about being present, we're talking about engaging our children, developing habits that are healthy and consistent with being balanced, being creative, and our interactions with our children, recognizing behavioral changes and redirecting those negative energies to positive energies. All of these strategies contribute to the children's self-regulation and behavioral changes. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight is, when we talk about building resilience, we talk about behavioral change, changes in thought processes. Immediately I thought about the neuroplasticity of our brain and how active the brain is. And as we take in new knowledge and new understanding, what's happening in our brains, that neuroplasticity is actually laying new wiring of all of that new information that we're learning and that children learn, whether it's verbal, whether it's textual, or whether it's behavioral. That new wiring in a child's brain is being laid, and the activity itself helps to sustain that and help children begin to change behaviors. And so how plastic the brain is, I always found that so fascinating. So I think that the more we can do to help our children in this process of building resilience, the more we engage them, I believe the healthier and better they will be. So I just want to thank all of the panelists for an outstanding job in showing us what building resilience really looks like.
Thank you for that, Earl. So we are back to our group discussion here. And again, we do have all of our speakers and Dr. White. And so I do have a few questions that have been coming in through the chat. So please excuse me while I look onto my other screen to grab those. So the first one that came out, and this really bounces off of Earl, what you were just talking about, is could resilience in any way be confused with suppression of what young people may be experiencing in this time?
Is it the same? Are you suggesting? But I don't think so. I think suppressing is detrimental.
Sure.
I believe that, and we've, over the years, as I work with children, I've seen that kind of suppression. And what it does, it really triggers a lot of negative behavior. And sometimes negative behavior doesn't have to be an acting out. Negative behavior can be a withdrawal, unresponsive, not engaging, and then can be disruptive in an unverbal way. But I will say that a child who has suppressed those feelings and those experiences can be reached. It all depends on we have to be very creative in our approach and understanding that child and understanding. And the first thing is finding out what appeals to that child. Be very surprised. What my experience has shown me, I've had a client one time who was just like that. And one of the things that they were able to do or identify with and able to help me reach them was art. And encouraging them. They love to draw, to paint. And so that was my way of getting them to really talk and kind of unload what was really going on with them. Yeah.
That's great. Does anyone else have any thoughts on maybe what people can be looking out for to understand through children's behavior if they're suppressing what they're experiencing rather than working through it or building resilience?
If I may, I understand the question, and it's wonderful to be sensitive to that, to try to see through multiple lenses what's really happening here. But that already says that conditions being created under which is going to be well supporting this child. I think as we listened across our panelists, one thing that we heard is that there was a whole set of different things to try with children. So complementing that with the types of things that Linda shared, for instance, leaving that blank space on the chart, right? That becomes an opportunity for the child to express how they're feeling, to be introducing emotion, content, and words, and opportunities for that discussion, that quiet time that Lynn emphasized as well. So, if there is a real concern, again, I think a lot of the same strategies, when you start piecing them together, can both support resilience, but then also make space for these other pieces that support resilience if suppression is occurring.
And I think Anne-Marie, thank you for pointing that out. And the question is a very good one. I think in the realm of this entire lifespan that we've been talking about, but specifically in early childhood and those first critical years that are also beautifully presented as being that critical time, the emotional literacy that children develop, the understanding that I have emotions, that you have emotions, that our emotions can be different from one another, that we can have multiple emotions about the same thing, and what the names of them are. Many children that are young, they may not be able to articulate themselves with language. And the most important thing I found in my career working with young children is there are no emotions that are bad. They're all good emotions. Anger is a beautiful thing. The way we express it is different, right? So feeling anxious and feeling excited to be home, for example, but saddened that we miss our friends at school. It's important to really develop the understanding of what emotions are and that there are no bad. If you feel like crying, maybe we just need to have a cry party because it's sad. We feel like we're going to have a drop down fit, which I always think is a really good way to get rid of some anger, isn't it, right? So children will express themselves, but sometimes they don't know what they're feeling. I think under these circumstances, I know I found myself not quite sure exactly how I'm feeling sometimes. And so if I have that at my stage of the game, when you're 4 or 3 or 6 or 10, it's very difficult. So I would add that to it. And that repression is sometimes holding things back, right? So that's where I would be from that stage of the game.
Great. So we have a question about the transition back. Once restrictions are lifted, and everyone's kind of transitioning back into those routines that we had in our pre-COVID existence. Do you anticipate that might be just as stressful for children and families? And what would you say to people that are kind of worried about how that transition may or may not be a little bumpy?
Well, I would start, and I think one of the things for young children, again, is if we can prepare them as much as possible, if when we have some predictability in an unpredictable situation, it calms down the anxieties that come with it. I wonder what will happen. Having a conversation with your child, it says, uh-oh, on Monday, we're going to go back to school or preschool or childcare. On Monday, I wonder what that would look like. What should we wear? What should we do? What do we used to do? What do we want to do now? That'll be very helpful. There will be a lot of stress. It's going to be stressful for everyone. We know that, for the teachers and for childcare workers and for our own work experiences. There's going to be a lot of stress. And I think as much as we can prepare and maybe visualize a schedule or a routine, very much like Linda did for her family, but something a little more age appropriate for little people, that might be helpful. I'm sure there's going to be stressors, but there's a way to manage that and build that resilience that Earl mentioned. Mhm.
I would
I was
also,
just, go ahead, Linda.
okay.
Go ahead, Linda.
I would also add that I'm a big fan of role playing with kids, especially for a situation that they're anticipating may be difficult for them. So, what do you think it's going to be like walking into school? How do you think you're going to feel? I used to, on first days of school that were big years, I would get my kids dressed the morning before. We would get up, we would eat breakfast, we would go outside. One day, it was the day before school and the bus pulled up and he thought we were getting on. I'm like, we don't start till tomorrow. But I wanted to get through some of the stress of the getting ready so that the stress of going to school could be its own entity. Sometimes we practice conversations. Oh, it's going to be really hard to talk to that person you haven't seen and you weren't in touch with. What do you think you might say? I know when my kids started middle school, we prepped at family dinner the week before school started and I said, I think you should have two open-ended questions that you can ask anybody you meet that would start a conversation. And so it wasn't, did you have a fun summer? Because then you get a yes or a no, and then you're stuck again. It was, what was your favorite thing you did this summer? That was my suggestion, but my son came up with one and my daughter came up with another. So anything we can do to help kids anticipate, imagine, and then imagine a successful outcome, I think is one way that we leave room for getting through those difficult and heavy emotions that go with starting again and transition. That's always a stressful time.
I was just going to say thinking about that transition, I would imagine that the schools would have certain strategies they want to put in place. But what I thought about was the communication between the schools and the parents and how they together can be creative in helping in that transition. And one of the other populations I thought about was our special ed population. And those children who are going back into that setting with those behavioral or learning problems, disabilities, and being very creative in how we help transition them as well. So parents working with the schools and being creative and what that's going to look like can really help. But I love the whole idea again with keeping their minds stimulated, having them become a part of that process and having them have a say in that process and talking about, and really listening to how they feel and what their thoughts are about transitioning, I think is very important.
Thank you all so much. Wonderful principles. I guess I agree with everything you're saying. And I think going back to what Lynn was saying about keeping ourselves calm, like test our own anxiety about going back. Again, our children take cues from us and go through that role play with them yourself. I think that could be really very helpful. I think, part of the worry or fear is people are going to expect kids to hit the ground running like nothing ever happened. So again, with that communication, like Earl is saying, with teachers is really lay out, okay, well, what is the plan to hold our children's emotions and to help reclaim engagement and feel safe in school and feel safe coming back together again. And if you, as we think about all of these principles, really it comes down to making sure our children still have a warm, caring relationship in place across that transition to ease out those bumps, identify those bumps, advocate on behalf of their social and emotional needs and wants as we all move again to an uncertain space. So that partnership communication with our children, with the other adults, is going to be very important.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. So there's a question around information that young people are getting from each other, and any tips that you may have on guiding the conversations with young people that you are responsible for or are working with in any setting. How do you make sure that they're internalizing the best information or trusted information as opposed to maybe sometimes the rumors that they get from each other?
I think that it's very important to ask a child or young adult where they heard the information when they tell you something. Everyone loves to be the first person to share the news. Did you hear? Do you know? Did you see? And I think some of those questions that we can ask about, so that's very interesting. Sometimes I'll say, so where did you hear about that? Very open, no judging, but I want to know more about it. And when a young person has to explain, well, I heard it from, then the follow-up questions can allow us to gather more information and ideally, at least to me, help a child to learn how to think more critically about information that they're hearing. So how did that make you feel when you heard it? That sounds a little scary to me. Did that feel like a scary thing you just heard about the virus? And then, they may say, well, yeah, I didn't really like it. Well, then it's interesting that you shared it with me. What do you think about sharing this idea with other people? Do you think that might cause other people to feel afraid? And trying to help a child link the thought you want them to get to with how we are getting to it and asking those questions to help them draw their own conclusions. That would be my first attempt.
Mhm. And I think it's all depends on the age. Again, the approach we have is has to be tailored to the child who's standing in front of us. And oftentimes that idea of critically thinking, developing that empathy is very important. So if we had the thought of, that sounds a certain way, tell me how you feel, which is exactly what Linda said. And then when my children were younger, which they're not now, but when they were, and things were, was after 9/11, that was very stressful for them. We had a fact and belief chart. We put on one side the facts and we searched out each fact. Let's find out what's true. What do you think about that? And then what might not be exactly factual, but it's somebody's belief or opinion. And let's separate them out and then see how we feel. And that was very effective because when they have thoughts, oftentimes children, as they grow, they can articulate, or you can guess that they have anxieties. Sometimes anxieties in little people are kind of hidden and they come out again in that behavior. So it's important to try to look at the child and say, where's your language? Where's your approach? And to really try to separate that, or just give lots of hugs. Come here, you must feel. That might be all it takes. You sound like you're afraid. Come hug me and we'll hug together. So it all depends on the child.
I just want to also add on that and I'm kind of taking a risk here, and I hope doesn't sound too negative, but one of the things that we have to take into consideration is that the question for me assumes that children have
Yes.
adults that they can share this with. And the reality is a lot of students will have these beliefs, have heard something that may not be true. A lot of the disinformation is out there, and they may not have anyone to really talk to help them kind of gauge that information and find out what is the correct information. So again, it brings me back to the kind of communication that the home is having with the school, and then and what we can do to help children with that disinformation, how we can kind of free them up of that negativity, because it will have a negative effect on them based on what they heard. So I think it really depends on the environment, the home, as well as the level of communication that is taking place. And for a lot of these children that I'm talking about, it may not be the parent, it may be a coach. who may get that coach may be the very first person. And Charles, I don't know, maybe you know how that is. You might be the very first person that student confide in with that disinformation. So again, the idea of having the students, or they know that they have somebody they can trust and they can go to who can help them with this as well. So that's just, just another population we have to think about, and helping that population transition.
Yeah.
I would just add, what this reminds me of is we can't ever outrun the speed of trust. So where children—
It's so true.
And thank you, Earl. Yeah, so where children, have that trust, first is respecting that, like that's a trusted source for them. And then really work to build the relationship. The relationship context matters to how we receive information, understand information. So again, just going back to the sense of building that engagement, making the conditions for trust to grow with that child is a longer term strategy, but one that will reap great importance in that child's life over time and in many other places too. So building towards that in the long-term way, I think, is another strategy to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all. So Earl, this is a question specific to some content that you had shared. Can you explain more about MBSR and how that might be different from school-based mindfulness techniques, if it is different?
No, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference other than the fact that, the other maybe is just school-based, but the idea of mindfulness is really to help that child really focus and be aware of themselves and be aware of their thought process and their behaviors. So there's really not a difference in that. I hope that I get some of that question. I don't know if I answered the question. Okay.
Absolutely. I think I think that mindfulness is becoming such a great topic, such a important thing that so many providers, educators, teachers, parents are tuning in on. And when we see it called different things place to place, it can be a little bit muddying. So it's great to just have that articulation that really all we're talking about is, young people making space to be with themselves and understand what they're experiencing.
Absolutely.
That's great. So this is a question specific to anyone who might have experience with young people with ADHD or something like oppositional defiant disorder. Are there any special cares to be taken or specific things that we can keep in mind as we're helping young people with some of those challenges transition back into their routines or back into spaces? I know a lot of us deal with those tier 1 interventions and universal things. So sometimes it's a little bit more to think about what a young person with other obstacles might need.
Sure. I think, Caitlin, the idea of a child with different abilities is, again, we're going to tailor our approach to that child no matter what age that child is. If that's a little person or somebody in elementary or in high school, we're going to tailor that. ADHD is there's a hyperactivity component to that. All children, no matter what their different ability are, whether they have autism, whether they have Down syndrome, whether they have whether they're typically developing, most children really appreciate that predictability and knowing what's coming next. And so doing a lot of talking in advance about what's happening now and what will happen. What was the routine? It could be using language, or it could be using a social story. It could be social stories. We could put up a link so that we can send that out. And it's pretty much putting a graphic, a picture to words in a simple way to prepare. It's really looking about, this is what's happened before. And that was a tight routine. Then we scrambled into our new routine. but something's going to change again. And most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, if we prepare well and listen to the child and work with the child's educators if they're available, right, or whoever supports them, their therapists, and it takes a team, it takes a village to raise all children, but it certainly takes a specific team sometimes, and ask questions about what did you use? How could I best do this? There are many people that can to provide some supports to help with that kind of an approach. And then we're going to start our new routine, or maybe it'll be closer to what it used to be. This is a new day. And so I think it's really individualizing that based on the child's needs. What works? Does the child visuals? Does the child, do sign language? Where are we with this child? And then try to communicate small changes. I like sort of what Charles said was habit stacking, so this is routine stacking and practice. Linda pointed that out. At any age, for any child, practice it, saying, we're going to pretend we're going to go to school now and roll it out. How do you feel? What's going on? Notice some of the glitches. And I think that's a pretty, while it's an intervention that's higher up the pyramid, or higher up, the tier 2, tier 3, we're really looking for those emotions combined with those routines and see what we can do and listen to the child. And just like Earl said, involve the child at every level, whatever stage, in an appropriate way, right? So we would involve the child. What should we do next? What did we used to do next? Right, that kind of an idea.
Thank you, Lynn. I wonder if this in part answers the question. I think about regulation and self-regulation, really supporting that for all children, really, again, knowing the child, knowing how they best can regulate their feelings and help them, find those quiet times, be focused, really support that. And again, one of the ways we really can support that is by supporting that in ourselves too. So I think, some of those, I hate using this term, but universals, I think that's one that cuts across, all children's experience, and it's a strength that they can have and grow, that can help in this time.
Great, thank you all. So we're just about to wrap up, but I just wanted to acknowledge that we at Children's Institute have heard so many amazing stories and anecdotes of what's coming in, that educators and providers are going above and beyond to support young people in this time, in the face of their own stress and anxieties of what adults are experiencing. So with our last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to make space for any of you to share some thoughts that you might want to share with anyone in the audience that's watching today.
I will go ahead and just say, I encourage everyone to be mindful of themselves as well as their families, and doing everything, the things that you heard today are strategies that work. And I do know that they work because you heard it from people who have actually put these things into practice. And I think that we can have a greater impact in a positive way on our children and our families to make it through this crisis and to come out the other side better people.
I would add, I think one cheeky way of putting it is we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Let's use them proportionately. So we have, our breath that can keep us calm. We have our ears that can guide us through that if we attend to that and we take the time to listen to our children, to show and earn that respect with them, and to be a witness to someone's grief when it's silent and when it doesn't have a place in someone's life anywhere else, is a gift that that wouldn't otherwise be present for that child And if that moment, if we miss that moment because we weren't listening in that one moment, then we missed an opportunity to alleviate some suffering or start a process of healing. So I just, really encourage people to use the gifts that we have just in our breath and our ears to chart that way forward.
I think, Emery, what you had said about your breath and how we teach very young children how to breathe deeply. And when we teach them that in and out, it biologically changes the brain to calm. It goes from our fight or flight brain back to our thinking brain. There's a very biological reason. Well, adults can also do things to light up, what I call light up. I don't know. I'm a big fan of brain science. Thank you, Earl. And when we physically write down or think of or become grateful for 3 things, there's always something to be grateful in most every situation. And when we do that, we counteract anxiety, we counteract fear, we counteract the other parts of our brain that are busying us. And when we do that for ourselves, we can calm down. It's very, very effective. But we can also model that age appropriately again for young children all the way through college. You can say, okay, what are you happy about? What are we happy about? And you can go right through what Charles talks about with his students. What can you be grateful for right now? And that lights up a part of the brain that counteracts, and it actually calms us. So there are different things out there that we can do to take care of ourselves, and at the same time parallel that experience for our children depending on where they are, and you'd have to adapt it, but it's very effective.
I would add in all of that is to give ourselves some grace as the adults around children. There's so much that we want to do, and there's so many expectations put on us, or maybe we put on ourselves. And any time that we can allow ourselves to know that we don't have to be perfect at this, we can't be perfect at this. It's an incredible opportunity to model to the children, whether they're your students or your grandchildren or your own children. I didn't do that very well yesterday. I didn't really have a handle. I was so stressed that I didn't really approach you the way I should have. And I wanted to tell you first that I'm sorry. And secondly, I'd like to try that again. So can you help me? Can we figure out how this could have gone better? I think sometimes showing that to children it's empowering to them. If they are part of the process, Earl, you talked about that too. Whenever kids are part of the process, they're so much more invested and they feel important because it matters. What they say matters. And anytime a child can feel like what they say matters, we're building trust like Anne-Marie's talking about, and we're building good habits like Charles is talking about, and we're creating routines like Lynn was talking about. So I would just offer that out, that when we don't get it right, it's okay to acknowledge, even if it's the next day or the next week, or maybe it's the next time you go into the classroom, you say, we were in this together before, but I really thought about it and I want to try something new, and I really need us to figure this out together. And then we become a new we, and we are stepping forward in a new way that might offer hope. And I would just suggest that as something that we can all do whenever it doesn't go exactly like we hoped.
As a parent currently of an 11-year-old, well, she's 10, she'll be 11 Monday, daughter. I just, no matter where and how in the moment I stressed I am or how busy I am, I'll reflect. It's like, oh my gosh, she was just standing here and I didn't pay her any attention. My mind was in all these other places. But when I have the moment to just say, okay, let me just take her lead. Let me, as we're social distancing, with the rest of the world, let me not social distance with my daughter and try to be present in this moment with her and just follow her lead and see where that goes. And, the times that we've done, it's led to play, right? Play-based, just play, which out of that comes learning. We've made some funny TikTok videos. I've didn't even know what that was on social media. But we'll look back on this time and we'll have an opportunity to laugh and see also where we laughed through the stress. And, you know, where we did find hope in our day because of our taking time to play. And again, following the lead of children.
That's great. Thank you all so much. So this concludes our 2020 Spring Spotlight Series seminar. Again, everyone that's still watching, you will receive an email with a link to an evaluation form. Your feedback is hugely appreciated. Completing that evaluation will also result in your professional development certificate for credit. And so we thank you for your time. We thank you for your attention, and we would love to hear your thoughts on additional topics that we can cover in the future. Thank you again.